You're live.
Hello everybody, this is a surprise Facebook Live tour from the Lethbridge Historical Society. We did the one here at Henderson on July 1st, but with the wind and everything, no one could hear what we were doing. So this is a repeat. Don't worry, again, we'll be saving this and putting it up on YouTube later. So if you're not actually on Facebook Live, don't worry, you'll be able to see this. So it's Belinda Crowson, President of the Lethbridge Historical Society. We're going to do a walking tour here of Henderson. Behind the camera is Jen Schmidt-Rempel. Again, if you do catch us live, please ask questions, make comments as you'd like to. But let's learn a little bit more here about Henderson. So, Henderson is not the oldest park in Lethbridge. That honor still goes to Galt Gardens. But it is one of the oldest and one of the largest. And there are so many stories about Henderson, how could we resist telling them? Now, of course, before there was Henderson Lake, there was Slaughterhouse Slough. So named because east of here there was an abattoir built by Pat Burns in 1906. And Slaughterhouse Slough was described as a 140-acre depression containing a large slough. So imagine, before they built the lake here, which was built a few years later, after 1906. In December 1909, Lethbridge City Council brought forward three money bylaws by plebiscite. They had to be voted on by the public. One was for a street railway franchise, so a streetcar system. Two was for a grass franchise. And three was the park purchase and development bylaw. Only the one for the parks passed. And it passed 138 to 38. So you imagine, there's less than 200 people voting in 1909, but they passed the right, gave City Council the right to build the park. And that gave the city the right to purchase and negotiate the purchase of this park from the Alberta Railway and Irrigation Company, which they did in April of 1909. They purchased 280 acres, and they also bought Adams Park on the north side at the same time. Now you might then wonder why they call it Henderson Park. As to the name, Mayor Henderson actually died in December 1909 while he was still the mayor of Lethbridge. And he died right around the time that the city was receiving permission from the public to purchase it. He was actually working on this project and trying to get Henderson Park built at the time of his death, so it seemed natural to name the park after him. Henderson was also the only Lethbridge mayor to die in office, so it was an honor that they wanted to give to him. Now, already in December 1909, right around the time of his death, developers were already promoting land sales around the park by calling this Henderson Park. But the city didn't actually make it official until April 1909, so there was a council vote to name this Henderson Park. So who was William Henderson? Well, as I said, he was the mayor, and he was mayor of Lethbridge in 1908 and 1909. As I also mentioned, he's the only Lethbridge mayor to die in office, dying of pneumonia in December 1909. Now, Henderson was born in Scotland and came to Canada in 1879 and to Lethbridge in 1885. He served on the first Lethbridge Town Council in 1891, and he was also quite a businessman, individually or with a partner, which would be Frederick Downer. He built several Lethbridge buildings, including the Lethbridge Hotel, the Balmoral Hotel, and the Henderson and Downer block, which people can now think of as the Club Cigar Store. Now, Henderson left quite a reputation. When it was formally decided in April 1910 to name the park after Henderson, Alderman Sage said this: "All service is great, even in common things, but William Henderson's greatness is worthy of record, more enduring than granted. We are honored by having this privilege to name the park after him." And so, from 1910 now until 2020, this has been known as Henderson Park. Almost as soon as they purchased the park in April 1910 from the Alberta Railway and Irrigation Company, they started on it. And one of the things they decided in 1910 was to start first with the exhibition. The exhibition was located before that in Victoria Park, so on the south end of Lethbridge. But in 1910 they started working on building the exhibition and moving the site over here. So the buildings of the exhibition, they started being built in 1910. They also had to get people out to Henderson Park. And in 1910, it was announced that London Road, 7th Avenue South, would be the road that would bring you out to Henderson. So they extended that road and they ran it north of Henderson Park, as we know today as Parkside Drive. 1910, the focus is on starting to build the exhibition, but in 1911, the focus turns to building the lake. So they actually had to take the old Slaughterhouse Slough and dig it deeper, and they hired a crew of 25 men, many of whom had previously helped to build the high-level bridge. And with large plows pulled by 4 to 6 horses, over months of 1911, they dug the lake. Now the lake did not look like it does today, but the beginning of it was there in 1911 with the construction of the lake. 1911 is all about building the lake, but in 1912 they have to get ready to fill it. And by spring of 1912 the lake was ready to be filled, and they used a flume and an irrigation ditch which they had built from the irrigation system. And the estimate I've been able to find in the old reports is they thought it would take 175 days running water only during the daylight to actually get the lake filled. So they now have the lake being filled. The next thing they built that same year in 1912 is they developed the streetcar system, and one of the routes is out here to Henderson Park. So in 1912 you have the lake filling, you have the streetcar system, the exhibition is constructed, first used in 1911, and we have Henderson Park forming. That same year as well, in 1912, we start to see the trees planted. So around 1912, we really begin to see Henderson Park starting to take shape and becoming the parks that we can see developing over the years. Now we have started our tour here at the east end of the park, and we're at the gunnery point, and most people in Lethbridge should know gunnery point, of course, because there's two giant guns here. These two guns are German guns that were taken by the Allies at the end of the First World War. In 1918, actually on Remembrance Day 1918, November 11th, the end of the war, the city became aware that war trophies were being offered by the Canadian government to cities and towns who wanted them. Lethbridge put in a request for 8 guns and an airplane, but we only ever received these 2. On the 12th of July 1920, just over 100 years ago, these 2 German guns arrived, and what we have here is a 75mm field gun, which veterans of the First World War called a whiz-bang, and the larger one is a 150mm howitzer. These 2 guns were first displayed at City Hall, which at that time was at 7th Street and 4th Avenue South. They then went to Barrack Square, where City Hall is today, and then they came here to Henderson Lake. They've been at different locations here at Henderson Lake, but since the 1980s they have been sitting here at the east end of Henderson Lake at Gunnery Point. They were joined in 2009 by the Armored Personnel Carrier. The Armored Personnel Carrier is actually Canadian, and it was placed there to commemorate 100 years of the artillery being in Lethbridge. So the story I've been told, that why an Armored Personnel Carrier, well, it's bigger than the German guns. So the Canadian one is the larger one at this area. So we're going to take a bit of a walk now. We're going to head around the side, going on the north side of Henderson Park, and we're going to go talk about why 1912 was such an important year in the construction of the park. What a beautiful evening.
You're up to 31 years.
Really?
Yeah, we're at 25 right now. We had 31, like, it started with 2, jumped to 14, and then it was up to like 31.
We're like, what's Belinda doing tonight?
Exactly. Well, it was a surprise one, but that's okay.
Well, who doesn't like surprising people?
Exactly. And I mean, they can hear us right now chatting. So.
And they can't hear us? Any questions right here?
Nope, not yet. People loving the event.
Mm-hmm.
People saying they like it.
Hi.
You want to take a picture?
Oh, no, we're doing a video, sorry.
Yeah, you want to take a video of somebody sitting here?
Oh, so we'll go to the Dry Farming Congress spot.
Yeah.
You know what? Knock on wood. It's in August without too many mosquitoes, too.
I know.
Ooh, your reflection is bright. One thing when we were out here on that windy day, we weren't competing with people making noise.
Exactly.
let you go ahead.
And there's no line of traffic like downtown. No line of traffic like downtown.
Downtown was trying to purposely be loud.
Exactly.
Here we are at the Dry Farming Congress.
Right. Let's
So
go
stand
closer
in
to, yeah, let's go closer to it so I can get in on it. Okay.
When you walk around Henderson Lake yourself, the one thing you'll notice is a lot of monuments. This one here commemorates the Dry Farming Congress of 1912. And you'll notice, remember I said that they filled the lake in 1912, and they knew that it would take about 175 days, and they were actually in a bit of a race, because they wanted to have it filled by October of that year. They didn't quite make it. It was pretty good by the sounds of it, but not quite done. Because in October 1912, Lethbridge hosted the 7th International Dry Farming Congress. This was a huge deal for Lethbridge. At that time, we were a city of about 8,000 people, and we hosted 5,000 visitors from 13 countries over the week-long event. Now, this was going to put us on the map. We really wanted to showcase Lethbridge. And to get ready, some streets were paved, sewers were built, the streetcar system was created, the exhibition had been built just prior, Henderson Park was built, and all of this was to showcase Lethbridge for these events. And the exhibition in Henderson were to be sort of the linchpin of it all. And so all that work was gone into making this all ready. So that's again why we always look at 1912 as sort of the year it all started here at Henderson Park. Now with that event, sort of as the beginning of tourism in Henderson Park. And tourism in Henderson Park went hand in hand, and it even got a boost in the 1920s, especially as tourists began arriving in their own cars. So imagine Lethbridge prior to the 1920s. The main way for tourists from any distance to arrive would have been the train. And that, of course, would have dropped them off downtown, and it would have dropped them off close to hotels. When the automobile industry started to really develop and highways started to develop, now you have to start thinking of tourists who are going to arrive in their own vehicles. And so one of the things that was started, and Lethbridge got onto the act in the early 1920s, was tourist camps. And the Lethbridge Tourist Camp started in June 1922, and it was located about where the tennis court is now, over by Pitt Stadium. The first year, 1922, the camp provided simply a camping space with a stove, electric light, and water. But very soon, the tourist camp developed into much more. By 1933, the lakeside cabins were constructed, and we know by 35 there were already 16 cabins. You can imagine you could arrive in your vehicle, rent a cabin, spend the night. There was a community kitchen, there were hot and cold showers, there was a laundry, they even had a telephone. They were quite impressed the first year they put the telephone in. Now, if you didn't want to stay in the cabins, you could tent, and up until the 1950s, tenting was still a possibility at the tourist camp. Everything ends at the lakeside cabins at the tourist camp in the 1960s. The cabins were sold off starting in the fall of '64, and soon the lakeside cabins were no more. The spot where lakeside cabins had been became the Lakeside Trailer Park, or Trailer Court, for a couple of years, but only for a very short time. And in the 1960s, we see the tourist camp gone. But that wasn't the end of camping here at Henderson Park. To the east of us, between the park and exhibition, is where the Henderson Lake campground used to be. In 1959, construction began on the campground, and it was ready for campers in May of 1960. Now, the campground was originally operated by the city, but the contract was given to Holiday Trails Resort in 1995, and the campground ran here until 2012 when it was closed. And that was the end of camping from the tourist camp and from the campground was in 2012. No more camping at Henderson Park. But you can certainly see that from the Dry Farming Congress, from the tourism, this was supposed to be a place that showcased Lethbridge in so many ways, and they found a variety of ways to bring tourists here. Now, the next thing we're going to do, we're going to go to the bridge and stop. One of the things I've been able to collect is some strange stories of Henderson. And, well, let's just say it has planes, trains, trains with the streetcars. Planes, trains, and automobiles are all at Henderson. So let's walk on over and talk some strange stories. We're remaking that movie, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
Are they?
Yeah. I don't know if it'll ever be as funny.
I don't think it will be. I've got your phone a little top heavy, so it was flopping over on me. That's what I get for taking a month off.
No. Oh, to be young and have that much energy. So, the water of Henderson Lake. From the research I've done, at least 2 planes, and so far I've only found 2 planes, have actually landed on Henderson Lake. The first was in October 1955. A float plane landed when the pilot, Tom Wilson, flying from Regina Beach to Vancouver, realized that evening, it was October, was coming much faster than he expected, and he couldn't get to Cranbrook, which is where he was supposed to stop. So he actually landed here on Henderson Lake. It took him 3/4 of the lake in which to land, and both the federal government and the city looked to see if it was illegal. The city didn't have any bylaws against it. They'd never thought of a float plane landing on Henderson Lake. And the federal government didn't have any rules against it, but they did send out a notice to pilots not to do that anymore. But he had no choice. He was supposed to leave heading west the next day, but being Lethbridge in October, it was much too windy the next day, so he had to take another day before he could take off from Henderson Lake. The second plane that I know of looks like it was actually planned and prepared. This one was in July 1957. Major Lee Holland of the United States Air Force was flying from California to Alaska, and he needed to refuel here in Lethbridge, and he was given permission to land on the lake. Now, when you try to imagine how on earth could 2 planes land here on the lake was quite different back then. Where the bridges are, where the islands are, didn't exist. Those are actually part of the redevelopment of the lake in the 1980s, and so the lake was larger in 1950s than it is today. But even so, as I said, the one pilot took 3/4 of the lake to land, so it certainly wasn't an easy feat to land a float plane on Henderson Lake. Now, not only have 2 planes landed on the lake, but there's been a car in the lake, and that was actually deliberate. An amphibious car gave the lake a try in 1962. Now, the car that was manufactured in West Germany and was brought to Lethbridge by H.J. Kerr of Lachine, Quebec. When it was in the lake, it was actually moved by propellers and could go up to 10 miles an hour in the lake, and it drove and steered on land like a regular car. And there is an amazing article in the Lethbridge Herald. One of the reporters was actually out here fishing when the car drove past him in the lake, and he has an amazing article about his reaction to it. So you can wonder what it'd be like. So far only 2 planes and a car that I know of. I know, and some of you will laugh, I've heard of submarines, haven't got any pictures if anybody wants to share them. We're going to head up to Battery Point. How are you doing?
I got a chair, so. Okay, what are you doing here?
We're taping a live video for the Historical Society.
Oh, you are?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you're not on right now.
Yeah, we are.
We're actually live.
Oh, no. I just wanted to put a word in about slaughterhouse snow deer on
Yep.
Henderson Lake. And if it wasn't for the spike ditch down in the Milk River area, Henderson Lake wouldn't exist. They wouldn't have water.
That's true too. We'll have to do a tour of that another time.
Yeah,
Good seeing you.
yeah. Didn't recognize you.
You never know where we'll be.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad you're doing that.
Trying to keep
Thanks.
some history even when we can't get together.
That's right.
We'll see you around. So we're off to Battery Point. It's amazing how many places at Henderson have names, and how fast you can, tell somebody where to meet you if you know all the points.
Yes.
Oh, see if the kids can get around us without hitting. Sounds like a locomotive coming. Now, I'm continuing to do research on Henderson. The one thing I'm trying to find out is all the roads, because there's not really good maps of the roads, but there have been about 7 different roads through the park at different times, So if anybody has a map of Henderson from the 20s to the 50s that I haven't come across, please let me know, because there was, well, Lake Drive and North Drive and a few others, Evergreen Drive, and I know many of them have been changed over the years, but that's the one thing I'm still trying to figure out is exactly where all the roads were at Henderson at some point. Wonderful how well used this park is.
Mm-hmm. I'm here every day.
I'm here again tomorrow.
Yep.
But I'm not doing a tour tomorrow, I'm just walking.
Yep. Here every day walking.
Yeah, that's right.
Hmm?
You live close, I live close.
Yeah. Might as well walk.
So I usually walk in my basement.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of people say, these programs are bullshit. But these programs do help. Just like everything else, it's a sickness, right? Yeah.
So we come now to the monuments, the Young Volunteers Monument and Battery Point Monument. So you might wonder why this is called Battery Point. When the lake was being created, you can only imagine how much work had to be done to maintain the lake, to plant the trees, water the trees, take care of any flowers, etc. And one way they actually maintained the park was they assigned areas around the lake to different organizations. I know there was an area where the mounted police did work. I know there were different groups. But the only place that we sort of know where exactly it was is here at Battery Point. And at Battery Point, members of the artillery battery were assigned to this site. Now it's actually a little more complicated than that. An April 1916 article talks about a new Battery Point where they just recently raised a flag and planted trees and flowers, and an old Battery Point where a flag was also flying and where trees had been planted 2 years ago. So there's a few areas called Battery Point, but this is where we consider Battery Point today. And what likely happened, being in the First World War, various military groups took on nearby sites in one large general area. That was Battery Point. Battery Point was also where the artillery practiced, and here on 8th of May 1914, it was the artillery who shot off their gun and opened the day that they came to beautify the park. And on that day of 8th of May 1914, 1,500 people showed up, and the 25th Battery shot the gun to tell everybody that the day had started. The Battery Point Monument was set in 1966 by the Royal Canadian Legion. That was for the First World War, and in the Second World War, after the Second World War, they set the Young Volunteers one here in 1996. Trees were planted here at Battery Point also in honor of First World War members who lost their lives in the war. So comrades and family actually came and planted a tree for each member of the battery who was killed here at Battery Point. So it's also one of the oldest memorials to any soldiers who died during the First World War. So there's a lot of meaning, a lot of purpose behind Battery Point. So now you know why we have Gunnery Point to the east and Battery Point here at the north. We're going to continue a little ways around, and we're going to talk about animals in Henderson Park. You know the story of people in Henderson Park, or we're telling that, but a lot of animals have lived here as well, and they have a story to tell. Beautiful, isn't it? You stop at the old cement ditch. Okay, yeah, steps.
At the old
Go a
steps.
little past because there's people there.
Okay.
Or the cement steps should still be.
Yes.
I'm not bitter. You probably are.
Do you want to be? Here. Wave and say hi for the Historical Society.
Doing a history tour in Henderson, so enjoy your day.
Have a good one.
Stop at the next little bend there.
Yep.
And you can look at the lake. And
Yep. Out here?
yeah.
Okay.
So let's learn a little bit about animals in Henderson Park. Now I think many of you know this story. It's one of my favorite. We actually had a zoo here at Henderson Park. It would have been still further west than this. It opened in 1912 with a lot of animals. The largest the zoo ever was 3 bears and 2 eagles. Unfortunately, one of the bears died and both of the eagles died. They also built a bear cage here, and there's quite a bit of a story about the bear cage. But they didn't build a very good bear cage, at least not, they didn't think about winter, and that in our mild winters, in a small bear cage, the bears might not actually hibernate. So in one January, they came out to check on the bears, and both of them were out of the bear cage. Needless to say, the kids of Lethbridge were locked in their houses for a little bit of time until they could put some food into the bear cage and encourage the bears to come back. Now, the park closed in 1916. And they always told the kids that they took the bears and took them back up to Banff National Park where they had got the bears and returned them loose. That's what they always told the kids. That's what I still continue to tell the kids. So if you're watching this with kids right now, you might want to close their ears, because what really happened to the bears is, well, quite a few people on Christmas Day 1916 had bear steak for supper, including the orphans at the children's shelter. So I've never had bear steak, but that was the supper for Christmas 1916 for quite a few people. So the zoo was short-lived, only 4 years, but Henderson Lake had something else for 30 years. Henderson Lake was actually an official bird sanctuary from 1925 to 1955. And when you look through the old Lethbridge Herald and other sources, there was a lot of warnings from the RCMP in the Lethbridge Herald, warning owners of .22 rifles that anything shot in the vicinity of Henderson Lake was actually a concern because it was a bird sanctuary. And it was even illegal to carry firearms through Henderson Park at that time. And so for 30 years, this park was a bird sanctuary, especially for migratory birds. To protect the birds, and also because there were issues, in 1932 they actually closed Henderson Park to dogs. Of course, today that's not true. Dogs can come to Henderson Park, but they closed the park to dogs. And the next animal that we sort of see connected to Henderson Park was actually muskrats. And I know quite a few stories from various families of trapping muskrats here in the 1920s and 30s. Of course, you could sell the muskrat pelts for some money, and in the Great Depression, that could help some families get along. And not surprisingly, we also, of course, have fish stories about Henderson Park. As soon as Henderson Lake was built, one of the things they started thinking about was stocking it. And over the years, it's been stocked with perch, carp, sunfish, and trout. Of course, also they stocked it with the grass carp as one of the ideas for how to maintain the weeds in the lake. We'll talk more about the lakes as we go, more about the weeds as we go along. So we know we've had birds here as a bird sanctuary. There's been bears here. There's been eagles here. There's been fish here. What you may not know is we also had sheep here. During the First World War, they had planted oats and grain here because it was easier than maintaining the lawn. But during the First World War, we're in a labor shortage, so how to maintain the stubble and how to maintain whatever grass they had planted. And they actually raised sheep here, and they had sheep to keep down the grass and keep down the stubble. Now, I don't know about any of you, but I was raised on a farm with sheep. I love the animals, but they are dumb. And what the sheep would often do, just north of us would have been the streetcar tracks. And the streetcar tracks, being metal, were a little bit cooler in summer, and sheep get hot. So they would lay down on the streetcar tracks to cool off, and then the streetcar would come along and ran several of them over. So that was sort of the ending of having sheep graze at Henderson Lake. That's not the only animals. We had another bear here. His name was Teddy Bear, Edward the Bear if you want to know his official name. Teddy Bear lived here about the 1950s, but he too only spent a little bit of time here. When the polio epidemic of the early 1950s hit, there were no children permitted to come to Henderson Park, and so Teddy was getting lonely, and so they took Teddy and they sent him to the Calgary Zoo. And from everything I've read, they actually sent him to the Calgary Zoo. Teddy Bear did not get killed. Sounds like he actually did go to the zoo. The other thing we know that was at Henderson Park, there was actually an animal pound. This is actually back to the 1920s. The fire department was responsible for rounding up cattle and horses that were roaming in Lethbridge. You can imagine, right, cattle came off the range, you have horses that got loose, and so if you saw a cow or a horse walking down the street of Lethbridge back in the 1910s, 1920s, you phoned the fire department and they would round them up, and they actually kept the animal pound out here as well. And so we know of records from the fire department, people coming out here and having to feed the animals and maintain the animals. So certainly there's a lot of animal stories at Henderson Park, and we'll see what else we can find. But next we're going to go talk about some sports at Henderson Park in our next stop.
Can't wait to see this. You're doing a super job.
You got to go on our Facebook page. It'll be up there.
Okay.
And then later on YouTube.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we'll talk to you later. I think we'll stop before the 30 kids, just because of the sound level. I like kids, but I know the noise of kids. So you can't talk Henderson Park without talking sports. And it would be impossible in a tour of this length to tell you every story of sports here, so I'm just going to focus on a few. We're looking across, of course, to the Henderson Golf Course. And golf arrived here at Henderson Park in 1912. Remember, 1912 is a very important year for the park. The Hudson Bay Company Athletic Club formed a small golf course on the south side of the lake in that year. Now, 1916, we're into the second or third year of the First World War. The Hudson Bay Company Athletic Club could no longer maintain the golf course, and in 1916 they surrendered it to the city, and the city decided to develop it as a new municipal golf links, which opened that year, starting with 9 holes. The old boathouse of the HBC Athletic Club became the initial clubhouse, and in 1916, for a season's membership at the new municipal golf course, cost you $5, which actually was a lot of money in 1916. In 1917, they made it more formal, and the Municipal Golf Club was formed. That club was actually renamed the Lethbridge Golf Club in 1925. Now, in the middle of the 1920s, a lot of work was done here at Henderson. We'll talk more about it when we get to where the old pavilion was. In 1924, they did more work on the golf course, and they added 4 more holes. And so by 1925, when they renamed it the Lethbridge Golf Club, we now have a 13-hole course. It won't become an official 18-hole course till 1934. In 1961, the old Lethbridge Golf Club was renamed the Henderson Lake Golf Club. And in 61, they renamed it the Henderson Lake Golf Club. And in 64, they got a new clubhouse to replace that new clubhouse, which we see today, which replaced the old Royal Canadian Air Force hut that was used from 49 to 64. And so we have 108 years of golfing on the south side of Henderson Park. Now, the other thing, of course, you can imagine here at Henderson Park is aquatics. One of the arguments that has come and gone at Henderson Park is whether to leave motorboats on Henderson Lake. Motorboats in 1913 were permitted, but off and on until they were finally ended in the 1960s. But when motorboats were permitted, they had all sorts of races here out on the park, and I'll be talking about a bit more about those as we go along. But there were also canoes. They had canoe tipping contests. There was sailing. We had regattas that started as early as 1913, and all sorts of boat racing was happening here on the lake. And one of the things, if you are my age or just a bit older, you might remember the boat rentals here, where you could get paddle boats and other boats. The Cropley family for a long time had boat rentals here out on the lake. The other thing, of course, when you got a lake like this, they had swimming here. Now, the lake was sort of in 2 parts initially. The large part here, and then the west end was more of the swimming area, especially when they developed it with the gyro, sorry, not the gyro, when the Rotary developed the west end as swimming in the 1920s. And so that was more the kids' swimming area, but the entire area was used as swimming. In 1925, the Gyro Club actually built a wooden pool here in the lake that was used for water polo, for diving, for race meets. And so there was a lot of swimming that went on here. But from the stories I've been told, because swimming in the lake stopped before I was born, or legally stopped before I was born, swimming in Henderson Lake was great if you didn't mind three things. Bacteria that made you itch, gave you the swimmer's itch. Leeches that would suck a little bit of your blood if you weren't paying attention. And the weeds that would tangle around your legs. So it wasn't always the best place, which is why, of course, in the early 1960s, they built the swimming pool, which was recently replaced by the new one. Weeds have always been an issue. And 100 years ago in 1920, the HMS Eradicator came to the lake. The Eradicator was actually a boat that was designed to go around Henderson Lake and cut the weeds. Almost from the beginning of Henderson Lake, the weeds were an issue, partly because Mother Nature builds lakes way better than we humans do. And when they built the lake, they unfortunately built it at the perfect height and the perfect temperature for the weeds to grow. And then, of course, when they brought in the irrigation water, they brought, things come in with the water as well. And the weeds basically were fertilized and did great. So one of their first main ways of trying to get rid of the weeds was this Eradicator, which went around the lake and cut the weeds. Now, what I've been able to read from various reports is that wasn't a good idea, because the weeds that we had in the lake, every time you cut them, so if you had one big weed, cut it into four, each of the four became a new weed. So it actually, in effect, seeded the weeds, but they tried to get rid of the weeds that way. And the weeds were always one of the issues with swimming in the lake. But aquatics and golf have not been the only things here. So far, these are the sports I've been able to find have been played or are still played at Henderson. They had a cricket pitch just over in the east end. Baseball, of course, since the very early, and baseball has stayed pretty much in the same place. As early as 1912, there was a tennis court here. That disappeared, and we didn't get the new tennis court till the 70s. There was lawn bowling here, and lawn bowling again. Soccer, football, they even played football in Henderson Stadium. In the 1940s, we had a miniature golf course here, and skating, of course. They had skating out on the lake, but they even tried to make it fancier than that. In 1913, they built a covered skating rink here on the lake. The city even put in a fire hydrant so they could flood the ice. The covered rink, the first covered rink, lasted about a week until the wind knocked it down. They built another covered rink, and that lasted just a little bit longer until the wind knocked that one down too. By that time, they were building other rinks in other parts of Lethbridge. So it would have been amazing to have seen a big covered rink here, but the wind just did not agree with it. And so ice skating on Henderson occurred, of course, but was never as grand as they were hoping it to be. All right, we're going to head down to where the pavilion was. And you know what age you are when you wonder what pavilion. I don't think any of us today remember the oldest pavilion. The second pavilion, a lot of people have memories of, and of course the third pavilion we passed a bit earlier. So we'll head down now. We got a bit of a walk to do, which is nice. We get to enjoy watching all the kids enjoying the park.
Yep.
And we have some people fishing in the lake. Another long-term habit here at Henderson Park. Haven't seen any monsters in the lake. I know, Jen, you always think there's going to be a monster.
Yes, we recorded it in Lethbridge Living. There's a lake monster.
There's a lake monster, yeah.
It's related to Ogopogo.
How it got here through the irrigation canal, I don't know.
It's just little.
Oh, it's just, okay,
It's just
baby.
little.
Okay. That's a story we might need to save for October.
Yep. We need to talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good advice.
I always thought the advice was you have to go camping with him. Then you find out who he really is.
And hang wallpaper with them.
That's true too. Something that's going to frustrate you, and then you know if you're going to want to stay with him.
Yeah. So there you have it, relationship advice.
Yep, from the
Date-
Historical Society.
Date all 4 seasons. Hang wallpaper, go camping. You heard it here
Just
first.
get them frustrated, that's the most important thing.
Uh,
Now, I said earlier that the islands came in the 1980s development. And the reason the islands came is one of the ways they wanted to get rid of the weeds was to actually dredge the lake and make it deeper, right? Because I said, unfortunately, the lake was at height that the weeds grew. So that the soil they dredged from the bottom of the lake was then used to make the islands. And so the islands were created in the 1980s. In the 1980s, as part of the urban parks, we got the River Valley parks are completely redone. We added new River Valley parks, and there was a lot of work done here at Henderson. So the 1980s are another decade where we see a great deal of work being done in Henderson, and a lot of what we have here today is from the 1980s redevelopment. One thing I haven't heard today, I haven't heard the gong from Nikki Eichelbaum if they're closed for the day. Not for the season.
no, but for the day, yeah.
But I haven't heard the gong at all.
I don't know what their hours are.
I usually hear it from my house quite often during the day.
And in the middle of the night.
Yes, sometimes in the middle of the night. I don't think those are actual visitors.
The visitors of the type.
Okay, non-paying visitors, is that a better way of saying it?
Something like that.
So as we're walking over on our right, that's where the tourist camp used to be. Now, of course, where the demonstration garden is and where the tennis courts are. Land has always been a premium here at Henderson. Trying to figure out what to put where has always been one of those deciding factors. And the city, from the very beginning, has always maintained ownership of the land at Henderson. So even if you, like, with the pavilion that we're going to be talking about in a bit, even though the pavilion might be owned by a private company, it was rented, the land and everything was rented from the city. So we're coming to the point where the East End and East Lakes and West Lakes used to come, and that was a very important place because that's where a bridge used to cross and where the pavilion was originally built. So the first pavilion was constructed in 1913 by Joseph Gillespie. Now, Joseph Gillespie is an interesting character of Lethbridge history. Up till 1912, he was the city police chief. In 1912, he accused his two highest up, an inspector and a detective, of bad behavior. They countercharged him and went to the mayor and said that he was the problem. The mayor, to get rid of the problem, just fired them all. Now, Gillespie was cleared of everything, but he did lose his job. And so in 1913, he actually built the pavilion here, working with the city. He then served in the First World War, came back, and in 1920 was hired as the Lethbridge police chief again. So we won't go into a great deal of detail about Joseph Gillespie, but there's a good story there. With that first pavilion, they had everything you might expect. They held dances, they had picnics, they could rent it out. They actually had rented bathing suits you could borrow. They had private dressing rooms, there were lunches, there were teas, there were concerts. Now that first pavilion was actually replaced by a much larger pavilion in 1926. And it's that larger pavilion of 1926 that many people remember. It was built by the Lethbridge Amusement Company, organized by A.W. Shackelford and J.B. Daguerre. That pavilion operated here until 1970 when it was torn down. And that's the one we have amazing stories again of the dances and the concerts. We know it had an amazing dance floor. There were bathing lockers, and it was a much loved place. So that pavilion, like I said, we lost about 50 years ago. And then we got the third pavilion that was built during the 1980s construction. as I said earlier, initially the lake was divided.
Hey.
Initially the lake was divided, and sort of where Nikiyuko is today, there was a bridge there. It was a bridge that cars could pass. It's a beautiful wooden bridge that was built and that was lost in the 1950s. The West Lake became the major swimming area, particularly for the children. In the 1920s, Rotary Beach was actually developed. There was a slide, the water chute, where you could climb up and slide down into the water. They had a sand beach, there was a floating raft and diving board, and it took 3 years for them to actually bring in the sand and build the entire place. And one of the things from the First World War into the 1920s, they were calling this Lethbridge's Coney Island, Lethbridge's Pleasure Park, Lethbridge's, you know, the place to be. There was even, for a short time, a merry-go-round here, and I don't mean the ones that we got ourselves dizzy and sick on as kids. I mean an actual carousel with the horses that you could ride and the music. They brought that in from the States. This would have been an incredible place for people to come to. It, again, ebbed and flowed, but by the 1950s, they decided that that old swimming area just wasn't good anymore. The bridge was taken down and a weir was put up dividing the two lakes. And basically what happened is the West Lake started to fill in. So when people tell you about coming here to a swampy area, finding tadpoles and collecting tadpoles, that would be the area there as the lake was drying up, the old West Lake. And the West Lake was eventually completely filled in and now forms where Nikiyuko is, the swimming pool, and where the Rose Garden is. And so all of that was filled in. 1962, as I said earlier, the first Henderson Lake pool was built, replaced by the one we have now in 2016. Now, I am still trying to find out that carousel, as I said, arrived here 1916, middle of the First World War. We got it from Tonawanda, New York. We have only one picture, and it's just a very small picture of some kids in front of it. I don't know how long it lasted. I don't know where it went afterwards. So if anybody has better stories than I have about the carousel, if you have pictures of the carousel, you know how to find me through the Historical Society, I'd love to see what we can find out about the carousel. So we're going to head a little bit further, and we're just going to talk about the Rose Garden and then head towards Nikiyuko. Hey, there's a boat. Has anybody been counting all the monuments we passed? We could make a scavenger hunt.
You could.
I think the city has them on the Historical Society. We have every monument in Lethbridge photographed and recorded. I think the city also has them GPS, so.
Oh, that's cool.
And we could use that for the scavenger hunt. Find the monument at.
And then you could do like the next monument and some clues.
Yeah.
Take you people to the next one.
See if you can find them.
Yeah.
Well, a couple years ago, I did that love letters to Lethbridge. I wrote love letters. City staff found a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I did them anonymously, figured out it was me, and brought me like 5 of them going, what do we do with this? I'm like, go hide them again, please.
Yes.
But then they did.
Good.
Passing me. Czechoslovakian monument. The Polish one is up in Adams Park, and the Hungarian one is outside Yates. But this is the one that was put up on the Centennial for Alberta in 2005. So we certainly, like I said, the number of monuments you find here are fabulous and amazing. Sorry. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we actually have the irrigation monument going on in the lake right now.
Oh, yeah, no.
So that's the monument here. Now, if you want to do the history of Henderson and I'm not with you, I wrote this sign and you can just come read it too. So you can read it in my voice and pretend that I'm standing here telling you the story of Henderson. But like I said, except for golf gardens and the cemeteries, you'll find more monuments in Henderson than almost anywhere. So we have our pool over beside us. Of course, between the pool and Mary McGrath Drive, you'll actually find the Rose Garden. The Rose Garden was built in 1967, or opened in 67, and was a project for Canada Centennial. And it was done by the Girl Guides and the Brownies, and it was a 3-year project. The Girl Guides and the Brownies raised enough money from selling their cookies, of course, for the sundial that's in there and to pay for all the roses. The rose garden was originally developed with 10 triangular beds containing 30 different rose varieties. All of them were built or planted around the sundial as a focal point. Mrs. O.C. Lockhart, and that was Liz Hall's mom. Liz Hall was the alderman, of course, or Jackie Hall's grandmother, actually obtained the sundial in England. Extensive work has been done on the rose garden, replanting it in 1986 with the redevelopment in the 80s and in 2012. Now, the rose garden is from the Centennial, so too, of course, is Nikiyuko. 3 early promoters of Nikiyuko were Reverend Yutetsu Kawamura, his wife Yuniko Kawamura, and Cleo Mowers, publisher of the Lethbridge Herald. Now, the idea originated initially in 1961 with Chief Abbot Otani of Kyoto, who visited Lethbridge in '61 and suggested that the Japanese community should build a garden. Kurt Steiner, manager of the Lethbridge Travel and Convention Bureau, worked to promote the idea once he learned of it. In January 1964, Lethbridge City Council gave their approval, and the garden was put forward as a project for Canada Centennial. A group behind the gardens formally became the Lethbridge and District Japanese Garden Society in 1965. And work, of course, continued. The tea house, bridges, and other elements were built in Japan, dismantled and shipped here to Canada, and then reassembled. Nikiyuko opened to the public on the 3rd of July 1966. I know that's a year before the Centennial, but that was sort of the soft opening. It was officially opened 14th July 1967 by Prince and Princess Takamatsu. Dr. Tadashi Kubo, the landscape architect from the University of Osaka, provided all of the design expertise for the gardens. However, he handed responsibility over to his assistant, Masami Sugimoto, who was the resident architect for the construction of the garden. And of course, work continues on the gardens as well. So this old area here of the West Lake contains so much more life now. We have the pool, we have the rose garden, we have Nikiyuko, and that old idea has brought so much life back again. So that brings us now to the end of the tour. I could keep talking about Henderson. I think right now I've got about 100 pages of research, but if I tell you everything on this, you won't buy the book when it comes out eventually. So, you know, I have to save something for it. Thank you guys very much. If you're watching live, watch September 7th. That's Labor Day. We're going to do a history of labor history, a tour of labor history. And